can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay. First of all, welcome. I think the first thing in order would be for us to get to know each other a little bit. We'll be spending the next couple of hours together. So I'd suggest that we each go around and just say our name and where we're calling from, and also any other little tidbit that you'd like us to know about yourselves. Because we're going to have some interaction. I'll have some presentation and some conversation, and it'll be interesting to get a lot of different perspectives. So I'm Sister Mary Ellen Green, and I'm a Dominican sister of Sinsinawa, and I live here in north central Wisconsin in Woodruff, and I'm on the staff of Marywood Franciscan Spirituality Center. And this is my first online program, so I'm kind of nervous, and I'm counting on you to forgive me for my mistakes. But we're in this together. So now I'm going to pass it on to Joanne, and just after you introduce yourself, pass it on to someone else.
In Wisconsin, can you hear?
Just start from the beginning again. What?
Maybe I'm.
You're okay now. Make sure you're on mute. No, unmute.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name's Joanne Ader, and I'm also from northern Wisconsin, up in Boulder Junction. And I'm delighted to be able to take part in this. I've been looking forward to this. Thanks. And do you want to go on to you, Grant?
I'm Grant Van Lishout, and I'm on staff at Marywood, and I'm currently in my basement with two noisy girls upstairs, so I'm going to try to stay muted as much as possible as well. Next on my screen, I see Sister Elizabeth.
Unmute. There.
Sister Elizabeth, and I also am part of the Marywood family, and glad to be here. And I get excited realizing that this is a new way of doing programs. It's being very successful. Kelly? Mary?
Which Kelly? Got two.
That one that's got the yellow around her. Kelly Casey.
Okay, there you go. Hi, I'm Kelly, and I'm in Minneapolis. A billion years ago, Mary Ellen shepherded me on my spiritual path, and with the Cincinnati Dominicans, and I'm grateful for that. I'm in seminary right now, studying interreligious chaplaincy, and I'm so happy to be on Zoom without it requiring a grade or a paper. Thank you.
Then Kelly, pick someone else.
Eileen.
I'm Eileen DeVette, and in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I have attended one other Marywood seminar, which was pastels. It was a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed it. And it's kind of hard for me to get up there to Wisconsin, but I'll be back. And this is great to have this here. Thank you. And I pick the other Kelly Hodgkins.
Good morning. My name's Kelly Hodgins, and I'm from San Leandro, California, right across the bay from San Francisco. And I'm excited to be part of this morning. I will have to cut out in about an hour because I have to go to work, but I'm going to do it remotely on my cell phone, the second half. And I pick Carol, who has to unmute.
Hi, I'm Carol. I'm also in northern Wisconsin in Woodruff, but I work on Trout Lake. I work at a UW-Madison Field Research Station right on Trout Lake, so I get the same view as they get at Marywood, which is a nice thing to share. And I was friends with Sister Julia, and that's how I sort of got involved with Marywood. I have to pick somebody. How about Marla?
I'm Marla. I had to get myself unmuted here. I'm right here at Marywood. The wind is blowing quite severely and kind of moving the ice towards our banks of the property here. So I hope you tell nature to move a different direction today, so we don't have the shoreline damaged too much. And it's a delight to be again on this program, as each one of us staff people, I'm a staff person, have been doing a program during the last week or so. So we're all kind of very supportive for each other's beginnings. We like to be here. And I would ask for Linda to speak and unmute. Linda? Oh.
Linda?
Okay, well, and that will be the first thing. I'm very hard of hearing and I'm new at this technology. So if you could try to speak loudly and clearly and close to your microphone. I live in Hazelhurst. I've been here 45 years. My husband was born and raised here. His family's been here since 1900. So we're very fortunate to be here during this time. Like many of you are, we can get out and enjoy nature. And I'm a close friend of Kay's, so that's how I got involved, and I'm looking forward to this. And I'll turn it over to Kay.
I'm Kay Tate, and I live in Arborvita, which is not far from Marywood. And I'm really excited about this program. And I missed the tip. I wondered if the person that gave us the tip about the hotkey to turn on and off the mute would explain that a little. And I'll pass that to whoever that was.
What was the tip for what?
There was a tip that showed up for how to mute easily.
Oh,
The
bottom
tip is if you hit the space bar key, it'll unmute you, and then when you let go, it'll mute you again.
Oh, thank you. Okay, and I'll pass it to Joan. Has Joan already spoken? Oh. So I'll pass to Joan.
Joan, can you hear?
Hi, yes, here I am, thank you. I am from Three Lakes, which is about 50 minutes from Marywood, southeast, and my husband and I live here. I am an art teacher, so teaching online for a small rural district, kindergarten through 12th, is very interesting right now, and I'm excited to be in this program. Thank you.
Now pick someone else.
I can't see others' names and pictures. Let me try here.
Pat? What?
Mary, was Mary called yet?
No.
Mary?
Mary Tickner?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Joan. It's good to
Hi,
see you.
Mary. Good to see you.
I'm Mary Tickner. I'm from Rhinelander, which is a little bit east and south of Marywood. Been involved with Marywood for a number of years, and I'm an affiliate with the Franciscan Sisters, which is Sister Marla's community. So wonderful to be here with all of you. Okay. Let's see, who hasn't been chosen yet? Patricia.
I'm unmuted, right?
Right.
Good. Well, I'm Patricia Bruno. I'm a Dominican sister of San Rafael. And like Kelly Hodges, I live in the San Francisco area. And in fact, I live in San Francisco. And I think I just got a new geography of northern Wisconsin. I've never heard of all those cute little places. They sound beautiful. So I'm delighted to be here. Mary Ellen and I have been friends for a very long time. I'm going to pass the mic to our dear friend Judith from New Zealand. So Judith.
Thank you, Patricia. Good morning, everyone. I'm Judith Ann O'Sullivan from New Zealand, and as the planes were not flying this morning, this is a wonderful way to be tuned in to you all. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, Mary Ellen told me about this, I think, when you were here on sabbatical at the end of last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I too am excited to be part of this community. It's just lovely to meet you all, and I'm looking forward to.
Tell us what time it is where you are.
It's 2:30 in the morning.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Yes. I didn't even have to set the alarm. I just woke up. Catherine of Siena woke me. She said, "Come on, get out of bed." So it's lovely to be with you all. Thanks, Mary Ellen.
Who else? Is Pat?
Oh, sorry. Now who? Pat.
I'm Pat. I'm on the staff at Marywood, and presently I live in Harrison, Wisconsin, east of Tomahawk. It's a cattle moraine area, so glad to be with you this morning. I think if Jennifer Laporte is here.
Jennifer has a chat that says, "Greetings from Jennifer. I have to step away for the moment, but will join in and out. I am in lovely Eagle River and will be a passive participant this morning. Thank you."
Okay. And I think we've heard from everybody else, right? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to be covering the lives of 4 incredible women who lived over a period of 800 years. And if we look at the first slide, we'll see their names. So hopefully you can all see the screen, and what we'll do is you'll be seeing the screen during the presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion after the life of each person. And at that point, we'll see the faces again of everybody. But the 3 individuals, the 3 women who are being honored today, or highlighted today, are the 4 women. Did I say 3? I meant 4. 4 women doctors of the Catholic Church. The interesting thing is there are 36 doctors of the Catholic Church, and only 4 of them are women. So we want to honor them. And we'll notice that they lived over a span of 800 years. If you look at those dates, it's interesting to see the differences in culture and politics and the church life that happened as you go from one to the next. And at the same time, it isn't so different from today in the context we have today. Next. So a lot of material that I used for this preparation came from a book called Accidental Theologians, subtitled 4 Catholic Women Who Changed Christianity. And it's by a woman named Elizabeth Dreyer, who's a retired theology professor. If you want to learn more about these women beyond what we talk about today, this would be a very good book to get. It's a thorough analysis of them, each of them in the context of her own culture. So on the top there, we have Teresa of Avila, and then down below, Catherine is the first one, Therese of Lisieux, and then Hildegard of Bingen. Next. So the question is, what does it mean to be a doctor of the church? Next. Okay, the title Doctor of the Church, as those of you who are Catholic, and maybe others too might know, the Catholic Church has a process we call canonization, where a person who has exhibited, a very holy, deeply spiritual life might be named to the canon of saints and considered, a special, to have a special place in the church beyond death. And of those saints, and there's thousands of them, 36 of them have been named Doctor of the Church. And the church definition of doctor is an official designation bestowed by the Pope in recognition of the outstanding contribution a person has made to the understanding and interpretation of the sacred scriptures and the development of Christian doctrine. So as of 2020, the official list includes 36 men and women who hail from all ages of the church's history. Of these, 4 on the list are women. So we started doing this way back in probably the 4th or 5th century. And until today, only 36 people have reached this status and only 4 are women. So anyway, that's one thing I wanted to say. And then next, it's interesting too to know when they were named doctors of the church. Catherine and Teresa were named in 1970, Therese of Lisieux in 1997, and Hildegard quite recently in 2012. Now, you'll notice that none of these women is a very formal theologian. I mean, like some of the men that, probably most of the men that were named doctors of the church have, degrees, and they have written lots of books, and they're highly esteemed academically as well as spiritually. But these are not formally educated women for the most part, but they are truly exceptional teachers who reflected on and absorbed scripture. They lived the Christian life in creative ways and wrote about major theological topics with passion and insight. So it's not only the head learning, but it's the heart learning that you'll notice in these women. And I want to just say parenthetically, we're going to have a discussion after each person. We'll do each person separately, and we'll talk about her features and so forth. But I'd like you, as we talk, to notice what are some common themes of all these 4 women, some commonalities, and what does each bring distinctively to the conversation that we're having. And then also, how can you identify yourself with any of these? Like you could say, I am most like this person or that person. And then what do they have to tell us today about ourselves and our church and our world? So those are some questions that if you want to keep as a backdrop as I'm talking today. Okay, so let me see where we are here. Okay, just a few more things that I wanted to mention is women have, these are not the only important women in the church or significant women in the church. Obviously, women have been a vital part of the Christian community since the very beginning days of Jesus, not to mention Mary of Nazareth, Mary Magdalene, Mary and Martha, and so many others who are mentioned in scripture. So there are many, many women who could be part of this company who have not been formally recognized. And as we look back into history, I think we need to be careful not to view them as irrelevant, backward, or not worth our time. I think the danger is to say that was that century, but what about today? There is a connection, there is a flow of energy and creativity and spirituality that continues to flow in our world today. It's also a temptation to think of them as perfect people, which of course they're not, none of us is, and we'll see a few of those warts as we talk about these women. They're not perfect, but they were faithful. And it's also a temptation for us to project on them our current expectations of feminism, for example, to say, why weren't they more this way or that way? Well, they didn't live in that world. So to put them in their own context of their world, their communities, their cultures, and to get a snapshot of what they were like and then compare with who we are today. So we begin, also one last thing before we get into Hildegard. I wanted to say something about mysticism, because that word keeps coming up in all of these women. And what do we mean by mysticism or a mystical experience? And that's something we can talk about a little later as we have a conversation, but I want to share with you an article by James Martin, a Jesuit who wrote this article for America magazine, and he has a very simple definition that I'd like us to keep in mind. He says, our definition is that a mystical experience is one in which you feel filled with God's presence in an intense, unmistakable way, as you feel lifted up from the normal way of doing things and seeing things. In it, you are simply overwhelmed with a sense of God in a way that seems to transcend your own understanding. And what he makes me think of is that very famous quotation from Thomas Merton, where he is in downtown Louisville, walking among the people, and all of a sudden he realizes that he's walking among holy people, saints loved by God, and his whole world is transformed. And many of us have had that experience of all of a sudden in a moment, it's like you're in a different space and you can see yourself and those around you in a different way. So this is something, an experience of mysticism that I think all four of these women have experienced, and I'll be talking about that. Okay, next is our first person, Hildegard of Bingen. Now, Hildegard was born in 1098, so 11th century, in Germany. She was a Benedictine nun, and the Benedictines at that time were pretty much the only organized form of religious life for women. The Benedictines were founded in about the 6th century by Saint Benedict, and his sister Scholastica founded the women's branch, and they became prolific all over Europe. And Hildegard was one of those Benedictines. You'll notice that two of them, Teresa and Therese, were Carmelites, and Catherine herself was a Dominican like myself. And I just want to comment, some people say, what's the difference between a Benedictine or a Dominican or a Carmelite or Franciscan or whatever? Someone mentioned to me one time, the difference is like this, that in the Protestant movement, you've got Methodists and Lutherans and Presbyterians and so forth, each living out a certain style or movement or flow of the Protestant movement. In the Catholic Church, in the same way, we have religious orders that do that. So we have Dominicans and Franciscans and Jesuits and Benedictines and so forth. Each, I always say, living out a flavor of Catholicism or a flavor of Christianity, which all ultimately comes to the same point, which is belief in the resurrected Jesus. But it's a different way of getting there. So we'll be seeing different styles of spirituality in these women. So we have our friend Hildegard of Bingen, who was absolutely extraordinary. Excuse me, bear with me here. She was the only woman of her age to be accepted as an authoritative voice on Christian doctrine. She was the first woman who received permission from the Pope to write theological books. She's the only medieval woman who preached openly before mixed audiences of clergy and laity with full approval of church authorities. She's the author of the first known morality play and the only 12th century playwright who was not anonymous. She was the only composer of her era, not to mention the only medieval woman, known by name and by a large part of surviving music. She was the first scientific writer to discuss sexuality and gynecology from a female perspective, and the first saint whose official biography included a first-person account. So she breaks the barriers of every situation in life. She herself was indescribable in terms of her influence. She was the last of 10 children born in 1098 into a noble family in the valley of the Rhine River of what is now Germany. And when a neighboring girl decided to enter religious life as a teenager, Hildegard's parents offered Hildegard her as a companion, which seems really strange today, but that's kind of the way it was, kind of a tithe to God. So she entered the community at the age 8, which was not unusual at the time. But later, as she grew and matured, she founded her own convent and was elected prioress. There were 10 nuns there in the beginning, and at the end of her life, there were more than 50 nuns who lived there. And it grown so much that she founded another community in Bingen, which remains a functioning community even today. So she entered at age 8. When she was 16, this was in 1158, she engaged in 4 preaching tours in Germany and Swabia, bringing her reform message to monks, clergy, and laity. She was a prolific writer. When you think of, I think of that Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, who has gone all over the world really preaching about climate change today and how extraordinary it is to see this teenager who is so wise beyond her years. And I think that Hildegard must have been something like that because she was so courageous in confronting the political and church authorities of her days. She wrote books, she wrote music, she was an artist, she was an herbalist, a botanist, a physician, she was a cook, and we have all these remnants of the fruits of her life. We have all of it. We have the music, we have the recipes that she put together. We have the music, which we'll be hearing a little later. As you can see here, she was a writer, composer, herbalist, philosopher, mystic, visionary, one of the best known composers of sacred music, and considered by many to be the founder of scientific natural history. Okay, next. Okay, this is something I picked up the other day. There's actually a cookbook of Hildegard's recipes, and she has a recipe for cookies of joy. They're supposed to make you happy. And the author says she considered a combination of nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon to be particularly beneficial. This preparation softens the bitterness of the body and mind, opens the heart, sharpens the blunt senses, makes the soul joyful, and diminishes harmful moods. So that sounds like a great remedy. And if you want me to send you that recipe, I'll be glad to do that. I made those cookies the other day and they're just delicious. Okay, next. Okay, so again, she was born of a large family in Germany. Next. And this was when she was 16 years old and calling for Reformation. I wanted to explain about Reformation because at that time, the Benedictines, well, the church life in general, especially monastic life, was getting very, very lax. People were not following the rules. They were doing their own thing. They were just, bringing with them, like when they entered the community, they would bring them a retinue of servants and expensive clothing and furniture. And Hildegard could see that they were getting way, way off the course in terms of what they ought to be. So that was her call for Reformation, was to try to reform the Benedictine order. And that's why she went on all these speaking tours. And she was confronting people and confronting the abbots and monks for their behavior. Let's see, where are we here? Next. Okay, so she had a lot of mystical experiences, and as I defined mysticism before, the experience of God's presence in a very real and vital way. And she would see lights. And she said, this is a quote from her, "Praise to you, spirit of fire, to you who sound the timbrel and the lyre. Your music sets our minds ablaze. The strength of our souls awaits your coming in the tent of meeting. So all beings that live by you praise your own pouring like a precious sap upon festering sores, upon fractured limbs. You convert them into priceless gems. So she would have these light and color visions, and then she would recite poetry that she composed from those experiences. Next. And she also was quite a physician, and she wrote 2 books on medicine, the book of simple medicine and the book of compound medicine, with lots of herbal remedies. She was famous for that. Next. She had a deep sense of the presence and power of the Holy Spirit. You'll notice in a lot of these images that I picked up from the internet, she has fire on her head, and that's a popular way of depicting her because the fire represents the Holy Spirit. So if you can imagine somebody who, I'm sure, you know, people didn't see the fire on her head, but she acted as if the Holy Spirit were constantly burning in her mind and soul. And that gave her a lot of courage, and it gave her a lot of credibility as well. She said, "Praise to you, Spirit of Fire." And then the next one here is a word she made up. It's a Latin word, but she made it up, called viriditas, which really means greening. And I actually like that word a lot because my last name is Green. And what she made it up because the greening of the earth is God, Mother Earth, taking over the trees, the grass, the fruits, the vegetables, everything that is alive is becoming green because it's being embraced by the power of God. She talks about planting, watering, improving life, fruitfulness, vitality, physical and spiritual health, warmth, freshness, fertility. She says green souls are filled with virtue and fervor for God and allied in holiness. She wants us all to become fingers of God in the world, and makes me think of the expression green thumb, like she has a green thumb. So she wants us all to have green thumbs and bring life and fruitfulness to everything we touch. Okay, next. She has a lot of really wise sayings that are often quoted, and I've included a few of them here. We cannot live in a world that is not our own, in a world that is interpreted for us by others. An interpreted world is not a home. Part of the terror is to take back our own listening, to use our own voice, to see our own light. She was very committed to being in touch with one's own experience and letting that speak to her of God. And next. So she wrote down a lot of books. She described 26 religious visions that she experienced, and it is the first of the 3 works that she wrote describing her visions. So she wrote three books, and the title was Scivias, which means knowing the ways of the Lord. The book is 150,000 words or 600 pages of printed text, illustrated by 35 miniature drawings included in her 2 later books of visions. So all of this has been replicated and is available if you ever want to do some study on Hildegard. One of the requirements for being a doctor of the church is that there be some written evidence of their theology, and she certainly took a lot of that and put it down on paper. She talks a lot about the Trinity in this Scivias. She talks about the Trinity, and then the second part she talks about her visions and about Christ in the church. And then the final vision includes 14 songs, plus a portion of a music drama. And in each vision she described what she saw and recorded explanation she heard, which she believed to be the voice of heaven. Next. Another beautiful quote, "Humanity, take a look at yourself. Inside you've got heaven and earth and all of creation. You're a world. Everything is hidden in you." So if you can imagine, she would have been very, very understanding and appreciative of our current movement of ecology and cosmology and the wholeness of the planet and the universe, and a whole holistic vision of life. Let's see, where are we here? Okay, next. Okay, and there's another quote here. And I spoke and wrote these things not by the invention of my heart or that of any other person, but as by the secret mysteries of God, I heard and received them in the heavenly places. And again, I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, cry out, therefore, and write this. You'll see as we go through the 4 different women, just a little spoiler, if I can put it that way, is I find that they all have these deep mystical experiences, and they all have this compulsion to share with other people, either through preaching orally or through writing. And thank God they did, because then that allows us to understand what they were thinking about. So she was really very famous for not only her recipes and her music and her plays, but for her theological and spiritual reflections. Next. Okay, I was very pleased to learn as I did this research that there still is an abbey of St. Hildegard in Germany, in Eibingen, near Rudesheim in Hesse, Germany. It was founded by her in 1165, and then because of all of the political revolutions in Germany during the 18th century, it was dissolved, but then restored again 100 years later. So it's the same site, and it's the same spirit that lives there. And I just think it's very interesting that people can go there. Women are continuing to join the community and carry on the work of Hildegard, but also you can go there on retreat or just to visit it. And if you look at the next slide, this is from the Abbey of St. Hildegard. It's from their website, and it's written by the abbess. And I just think it's very homely. Dear visitor, you have come to visit our abbey, and I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you. We are indeed pleased to receive every guest. Did St. Benedict not particularly ask us to welcome our guests as Christ? Some of you have found your way here by following the footsteps of our patron saint, St. Hildegard. Others may be intrigued with the life of a Benedictine community of 48 nuns. That's a very large community these days. Youngest is 30, the oldest is 94. Or else you might be looking for answers to fundamental questions concerning life or faith. For all of you, we would like to be open and receptive, bearing in mind that our own possibilities and resources are limited. We invite you to pray with us and participate in the divine office. Next. We invite you to approach us in conversation, get to know our arts and crafts shop, and so forth. In this way, we may experience together a little of the infinite comfort of the Holy Spirit and take it with us. This is what I ask in prayer for you and for us all, heartfelt wishes. And this is a photograph of the current abbess, of the one in charge of the abbey. So these nuns, what impresses me is that they are carrying on the work and spirit and thought and energy of St. Hildegard of Bingen, and they're doing it in a 21st century context, and they're keeping it alive. And one of the things they do is they sing the office and the Eucharist, and they use the music that Hildegard herself wrote. And I want to end this section by having you listen to just a section of a hymn being sung actually by these sisters in this abbey. Okay, now we're going to stop and you can remove the screen. Okay, oh, good. You're still there? I was just watching my own face in the screen and I was like talking to myself. So this is a chance just for about 5 or 6 minutes, however long we want to do it, to talk a little bit amongst ourselves as to, and I'm going to do this gallery here. Let's see how we do this. We want to be able to see everybody. There, okay, now I just click gallery. Do you see everybody pretty much? No?
Sister Mary Ellen,
Yeah?
I don't think we can hear you.
Oh. Where am I?
I can hear her, Grant.
I can hear her.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. Okay, so anyway, what I want to do is to take, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to do is to take just a few minutes to talk about it. As you listen to and looked at the images of Hildegard and her context, and again, it's just skimming over the surface of what this woman was. I mean, she was a giant. We could call her today a Renaissance woman, but she lived before the Renaissance, so they would never have used that expression. I did run across a word called polymath. Anybody know what a polymath is? It's a new word for your vocabulary. A polymath is a person who knows a lot about a lot of things. And so anyway, that's just a new word I learned. But what I want to ask you is, what is it that strikes you as being really unique or attractive or remarkable about this woman? And also, what questions does it raise in your mind? Or do you have some experience of Hildegard? Maybe you've read a book about her. There's actually been a movie made about her. So anything you want to do to add to what I have said already. Maybe if you just raise your hand, go to reactions and raise your hand like that, and then I'll know that you want to talk.
Okay. Kelly has her hand raised.
Where are you? Okay, go ahead.
I'm just like struck at how self-aware she was. I mean, if I was to talk like she did, people would like, have you taken your medication today? And you know, we have categories in the DSM-5 for people who have religious visions like they're crazy. I can't, first of all, her being a woman, wow. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I have imposter syndrome all the time, so I don't know how she was able to balance all that. It's definitely a grace for sure, but it's amazing that you know, that she had respect. You know, obviously the Holy Spirit was working on the Pope and everybody else, because today when we women speak our truth, we're not often heard. And she's kind of encouraging her quotes, especially, you know, as a woman who wants to do ordained ministry. The Catholic Church isn't providing that for me. She didn't care. She just did her thing. So
she had probably as much influence as any bishop in her day. You know, she was just held in great esteem and credibility. And not that she didn't have her detractors, but, you know, she just didn't let them get in her way. Marla, did you have something? Oh.
Like the little phrase towards the end there, she said, take back our own listening. I didn't quite catch the whole quote, but that she trusted the Spirit speaking within her, and encouraged other people to trust that same Spirit, to take back their own listening.
Mm-hmm. You're going to hear that again in some of the other women we talk about too, is trusting our own experience. Not just because somebody taught it to me or that I read it in a book, but that I experienced it myself. I think that's a feminine gift, to be able to tune in to your own feelings.
Mary Ellen, I forgot to
Your cat
mute
is,
myself.
my cat is listening intently.
What does she think?
Mary Ellen, I forgot to mute myself before, but I was wondering, how was she received by the members of her community?
Well, you know, when I mentioned when she first entered the community, she was only 8 years old, and things were pretty off the wall in terms of laxity, shall we say, you know, and, you know, they were having parties every night, and they didn't keep silence, and they were going out and, you know, not saying their prayers. Well, then she realized that there was some reformation that was needed, and guess what? Some of them didn't like it. And some of them were really angry with her, and they resisted her quite a bit. But then after a while, she took her own followers and formed a new community. But, you know, people don't like to be told what to do, and they were having fun. So she said, you do your thing and I'll do mine. And she, you know, formed a more strict, more orthodox kind of lifestyle in a new community. And also, it isn't that she was never criticized by the church authorities and the political authorities because she was a woman, you know, and they did criticize her and challenged her. And so she had to constantly stand up for herself, which she did. But she trusted herself and didn't make any excuses. You know, I think of her as somebody like Joan Chittister or Elizabeth Johnson, you know, today, you know, strong women that, you know, they've gotten a lot of criticism, or Helen Prejean, you know, they've gotten a lot of criticism, but they stick with what they believe and change the world, really.
No, I'm not sure if I'm unmuted, am I?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I couldn't find the little hand thing to raise my hand, sorry.
It says reaction.
But yeah, I was thinking as you did the overview, how important the orders are. And granted, at that time, they didn't have communities like St. Joseph of Orange community or, you know, sisters, charity sisters as communities. But I was thinking, what a protection in a way the orders have been. And because in a way they run parallel to church structures often. And so it's true about, you know, your founder and foundress, the Franciscans, for your community there at the center. So that's one of the things that struck me. And I thought the other thing is, and I think it was Casey who brought it up, how different the church atmosphere was with accepting a new voice in the community, a woman's voice in the community. And how, as you said, Mary Ellen, she really had the authority of a bishop. And that's one of the gifts of the orders too. They can break the boundaries of bishops' areas. So she was an extraordinary woman living at a time where her gifts were truly appreciated. And I think you can see, as you also said, the great tradition that comes from the Benedictines today with Joan Chittister and so many of their sisters writing on the Psalms and doing preaching through writing.
Also, what you're reminding me of, Patty, is the Rhineland mystics, the whole movement, and you could maybe speak to that since you did that pilgrimage. Do you want to just comment on that? The whole context of the Rhineland mystics.
Yeah. Well, it's I don't know what exactly to say, but it was like a womb of creativity and mysticism. And what struck me about it too, and they could get away with saying things because so often they used poetry to speak about it or imagination. So rather than hitting at, you know, what is the definition of something, they went way beyond that. And I was thinking of the idea of mysticism I think Karl Rahner, a Jesuit, has a lot to say about it, that really it's the ability to be able to experience the joy and the reality that's underneath the surface of everyday life. So it's the ability to see things differently, which you mentioned, and to allow that experience to give us an emotional feeling about it, not just an intellectual conviction.
Mm-hmm. That's good. The Rhineland mystics was a movement, if I can put it that way, of mostly women, but some men as well, who lived in the Rhineland area of Europe, in Germany and Austria and those places. And they were very much like Hildegard of Bingen. She was probably the greatest of them all, but there was Gertrude the Great, and there was Mechtilde of Magdeburg, and
Meister Eckhart.
Meister Eckhart was a Dominican priest, yeah. And there was a whole movement that she was part of it, loosely part of it. And as Patty said, it was a new emergence of, she would say, viriditas, the greening of the church, the greening of the world, and people just daring to speak out what was in their heart. Anyway, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Rhineland mystics, but anyway, that's another whole movement that we can talk about at another time. Okay, anything else before we take a break? Yes, Joan? Joan?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just wondered, as Hildegard was growing up in the Abbey, surely there must have been a mentor or somebody that was a companion to her as, developing between like the ages of 8 and 16. It's like, how, in such a disruptive atmosphere, how could she keep her own strong spirituality? There must have been somebody taking her under her wing or something.
Picture an 8-year-old girl in the middle of all that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Grant has a little daughter who's 8 years old. Can you imagine her? Yes, she went in at the same time as her neighbor, who was a teenager at the time, and I assume that the teenager took her under her wing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but she must have been a child prodigy, though. I mean, to do all that on her own and develop, and she began reading and praying, and she just was a very gifted woman in every sense of the way, and she used her gifts. But I assume she had some mentors there in the community, besides the nasty ones who were partying all the time. Okay, let's take, Grant?
Kay had her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Where are you, Kay? Yes, go ahead. Unmute. Unmute.
I had the very same question as Joan. I found it amazing that at the age of 8 that she could do that, and she must have had support somewhere, and I was curious about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a young time to be taken.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's bad enough to go to boarding school, but then to become part of a community of cloistered nuns, Yeah. So anybody else commenting? Okay, let's take about a break, maybe 6 or 7 minute break. And then we're going to move into Catherine of Siena, whose feast day is today. So she's a very special person. So we'll come back to 1847. So about 200 years later, right? Okay, I wanted to mention too, in this book that I recommended called Accidental Theologians, Elizabeth Dreyer, the author, she gives each one of these 4 women a niche in theology. And for Hildegard, she said, hers is a theology of the Holy Spirit. Now think about this a little bit, that all of her theology, all of her writing and her talking and her praying around, her God experience focuses in on the power of the Spirit and how the Spirit transforms us. So that's the context in which she teaches theology. Now with Catherine, we're coming up to next here, her theology, according to Dreyer, is the theology of incarnation. or bodiliness or physicality. She was, let's look at the first one there, the number 23. No, go back one. Okay, no, back, no, there, okay. So she was born. Her Italian name was Caterina di Giacomo de Benincasa, known as Catherine of Siena. Born March 25th, 1347, and died April 29th, 1380, and that's why today is her feast day. And we honor her among the Dominicans, especially. So, as I said, thinking of her theology of incarnation, kind of keep in mind what a key element of physicality or bodiliness was for her spirituality. She's a very earthy person, as all of them are, but she is in particular. And I like this quote from her here: "To the servant of God, every place is the right place, and every time is the right time." So that's something to keep in mind these days when we wonder who we are and what we're doing. That statue that we see depicted there is probably the most famous statue of her, and it's in Rome, and it's a bigger than life stone statue, and it shows her walking from down the Via della Conciliazione in central Rome down to the Vatican to go to Mass every day. And she died in Rome, and she influenced the city of Rome quite a bit. Okay, so contrasting her with Hildegard, who was a cloistered Benedictine nun, Catherine was not cloistered, and she was not a Benedictine. She was a lay Dominican, and she was intensely involved in the world. But in the end, was her spirituality so very different from Hildegard? So kind of keep that question in mind as we talk. Okay, next picture. This was her family home. And as you can see, this is taken this is a contemporary photo. You can still visit it now. And she was the 24th of 25 children of Giacomo and Lapa Benincasa, who was a prominent and successful wool dyer in the prominent and successful city of Siena in Tuscany, in central Italy. In those days, the large cities of Italy were not only just cities, but they were like nations unto themselves. They called them city-states. Like Siena was a city-state, and Florence was a city-state, and there were others in the area. So there was a strong identity with the city and its customs and its culture, and she was definitely formed by her time in that city. Now we picture mother, father, and 25 children, some of whom died in childbirth, of course, too, living in that, but also not only them, but their aunts and uncles and cousins and nephews and nieces. So there were a lot of people who lived in that house, and the house was the business for the father, who was a wool dyer. Next. Okay, and this very close to where they lived, which you can see, actually, I don't know if you can, do you see that building with on the lower right-hand corner there, with a kind of a flat roof and the balconies? That's the family home. And that's how close it was to the church, was the Church of St. Dominic. So that was a very important piece of her growing up, was this place where the Dominican friars served and said Mass every day, and she knew them well. In fact, one of her cousins, Tommaso, was one of the friars, and she went to Mass there every day and was really part of the Dominican family even as she was growing up. When she was 6 years old, she and her brother Stefano were walking up the hill behind, kind of perspective from where we're watching it, and she saw in the sky above the church a vision of Christ with Peter, James, and John. And she stood there and she watched them, and she got the sense that she was being called to something extraordinary. And she decided at age 6 to devote her life to Christ. And it was a complete change in her life. And again, you'll see in all of these women that we talk about, they had this sense of God's presence and God's call at a very, very early age. And it was authentic, and it grew, and they were mentored, and yet the grace of God was at work in them. So after this vision, she started to become very quiet and prayerful. But her family wanted her to prepare to get married when she was old enough, and she didn't want to get married. So guess what she did? Next slide. Next. Oh, okay. She cut off her hair. And now in those days, that was a real strong act of resistance, because a woman's hair was her beauty and her seductiveness, and it was the gift that she would give to her husband and what attracted her to her husband. We also see this, those of you who are familiar with St. Francis and St. Clare, that St. Clare also did this when she entered the Franciscan order, so it was not unheard of. And maybe Catherine knew about that, because they were both Italians, and stories used to go back and forth about the Franciscans and the Dominicans. So anyway, she cut off her hair so that she would not be so attractive to men, and it was a very dramatic gesture. And when she was about 16, next, she joined what they called the Montellate. Now, there were no, you could have said, why wouldn't she join a convent? Well, first of all, she was so young. But secondly, there weren't any Dominican convents in that area. And the convents in those days were cloistered convents. A woman would enter the convent and stay there her whole life and pray, and that was her main task in life, was to pray. Catherine didn't feel called to that kind of a life, and she didn't have the opportunity to join what we would call today religious life or apostolic life, for example, as some of us who are sisters have. That particular way of being in the church was not even identified until the late 19th century. So she could either be a woman who was single, or a woman who was married and had a family, which was much more typical, or she could be what we call lay Dominican or secular Dominican. Some of you might be secular Franciscans. It's a kind of loosely defined participation in the Dominican traditions and spirituality. But the Montellate were women who, from Siena, most of whom were older women, and they were widows. And they took on the Dominican, lifestyle, as it were. And she wanted to join them, but she was only probably about 16 or 18 years old at the most. And they didn't want her to join them because she wouldn't fit in. And she did anyway. And she wore the Dominican habit, and she lived life that they did, saying their prayers and going out and really, taking care of people. The next slide. Okay, so what she did, excuse me just a second. Oh, she went out into, this is the city of Siena right here that you're looking at. And again, it's a modern picture, but it looked pretty much like that at her time. This was the main, they call it the Campo, but we would say maybe the plaza or the piazza, the main town square, where they have horse races every year, and they're famous for that. But people congregate in there, and there are restaurants and shops, and it's the heart of the city. So she would have been there many, many times, and she would have been visiting the sick, caring for the sick. She would have been shopping for her family. She would have been visiting some of the government people and maybe challenging them on what they were doing. She was very involved and very, very busy. And then the next, let's see, what have we got here? Well, we're a little bit ahead of ourselves. You want to go back to the last Siena? I want to mention one other thing. So after she joined the Montellate, she decided that she wanted to take some time to be alone. This is a very important experience in her life. And again, she was probably 16 or 17 or 18 years old, just a teenager. So she wanted to spend time praying and fasting in her bedroom, in her family, and picture this huge family in this huge house, and they thought she was crazy. They really thought she was crazy. And finally her father, kind of understood where she was coming from, and he said, okay, we'll give you a little room at the bottom of the stairs, and that can be your room, and you can go there for as long as you want. So she went in this little room that she called her cell, and she had a stone for a pillow. And she fasted and she prayed for 3 years, practically never came out of the room. And during that period of 3 years, she had some really deep mystical experiences. One of which, she had this experience that Jesus came to her and exchanged his heart for her heart. Sometimes we have paintings of that. So he said, I want you to love with my heart and I will love with your heart. So that was a very, very intimate experience of being with Jesus and sharing in his life and in his mission. And then there was an exchange of rings, like wedding rings. And then there was also just all kinds of, I'm trying to think of another one, exchange of hearts, exchange of rings, espousal, a wedding, like he really wanted to marry her. So she was having all these kind of mystical experiences, and her intimacy with Jesus was just unbelievable. Now, let me just say parenthetically, some people say that it was because she was fasting so much that she was delirious. Now, you can think whatever you want to think, and maybe she was delirious, but the fact is that this is what she remembers, this is what she records, this is what she has shared with her followers, and it did, have an immense effect on her spirituality, and she always was very, very identified with Christ. And again, getting back to her theology of incarnation, that it was the body that was so important, the heart, the ring, and that. Finally, after 3 years, something happened. Jesus came to her again, and he said, all right, Katarina, you've had 3 years of prayer and fasting. We've had some wonderful experiences together. This has been very consoling. It's been very challenging, but it's time to get out of here and get to work. And she said, no, I don't want to, because I really, really love being here with you and I love praying with you. And he said, that's not what it's about. I'm asking you to love me by loving my neighbors. And he said, when you leave here, I want you to walk on 2 feet, the foot of love of God and the footstep of love of neighbor, the foot of prayer and the foot of service. So she very reluctantly got up, got out of her room, went outside, and she started slowly walking with 2 feet. And she herself talks about that quite a bit, about how that was a conversion moment for her, when she realized that if she were to follow Christ, she couldn't just hide herself. She had to be out there among Christ's people. And she, in order to preserve that sense of intimacy with Christ, she developed what she called her cell of self-knowledge. It was an imaginary room inside of herself that she could return to whenever she felt anxious or lost or alone and separated from him. So she always had that cell of self-knowledge within her. Okay, so then she went out. You can still keep it at this because she's still in Siena here. She went out and she... one of the things she did was serve the people who were victims of the Black Plague. Now, we can understand maybe a little bit of what this must have been like today when we have our coronavirus plague. But the Black Plague was the most violent epidemic in recorded history. It was not the same as the bubonic plague, which is something else. But the Black Plague was during this 14th century the most virulent, the most violent epidemic in recorded history. Over 25 million people were killed. And if you keep in mind proportionately the population, and we're talking probably just Europe because there wasn't any communication with other continents, 1/3 of the population died, including 60% of the population of Siena. So figure that out in terms of the kind of numbers we're talking about today. And Catherine was right there in the middle, going to visit people in homes and hospitals and caring for them and holding them while they were dying. And she just was in the throes of it all and never herself got sick. And after the plague settled down a little bit more, she followed, she went out to other cities and in Florence, especially in Rome. And there were more and more people who followed her, men, women, sisters, priests. She called them La Familia, my family. It was like a group. They were like groupies, and they went with her everywhere she went, and they helped her and they accompanied her. And one of the people who was with her most of the time was Raymond of Capua, who was a Dominican priest, very famous Dominican priest, who became her spiritual director. So she began to her world expanded, let's put it that way. And as her world expanded, she began to be criticized more and more. She was criticized for being out at night when she was taking care of the sick people. She was criticized for speaking out when she should have been quiet as a woman. And finally, the Dominican friars called her to their chapter in 1374 and interrogated her about her teachings and said, she was fine, and they gave her their blessing. And she was cleared of that criticism. One of the things, and this next slide shows you that was happening at her time, was what they called the Avignon captivity. There was a period of a number of years where there were 2 and sometimes 3 different popes competing for authority. And it became very political, and the popes, one of the popes at least, of each of those periods of time, went to Avignon, France. It's in the south central France. And there's a palace there called the Palace of the Popes that you can visit. And so over a series of years, Catherine was appalled at the situation because it was splitting the church apart. So she actually walked, now picture this, she didn't have a horse or anything. She walked from, probably she was in Florence or Rome at the time, all the way up to southern France along the coast. And she had her retinue with her, and they stopped and prayed and preached along the way. And she confronted Pope Gregory XI and said, Papa Gregory, it's time for you to go home. You're splitting the church apart, and this is not good for the church. And after a long time, she finally persuaded him to go back to Rome. And here he is starting to go to Avignon, and then later on he went back to Rome, and things settled down there better in the papacy. But can you imagine a woman at that time, probably in her mid-20s, confronting the Pope face to face and saying, you go back where you belong? And she had enough credibility that he really responded to her. What do we have next? Okay, next it would be, if we're in Florence now. She went to Florence from Siena. I just want to mention that she never learned to read or write. She never went to school, but she dictated letters, and she dictated dialogues she had with God, and she dictated poems. And we have a lot of those are extant. They've been translated into English, and we have all the volumes of what she dictated. What interesting thing is we have at least 400 letters that she wrote to persons of influence. Sometimes she would write 3 letters at a time. Like she'd have 3 different secretaries with her, and she'd start a letter saying, Dear Pope Gregory XI, and then she'd go to the second secretary and say, Dear Joanne, and then the third one she'd say, Dear Elizabeth, and then she'd go back to the first one again, and she'd write a sentence, and then another sentence, and another sentence. So she was so impatient that she dictated 3 at the time, and she never got mixed up. I don't think I could do that, but they still have these letters. But they were always letters of encouragement and challenge, and really trying to get people to follow Christ in a more authentic way. She had no doubt one of the finest minds of the era. Even though she wasn't educated, she was probably the most brilliant person in that era. She challenged the church, but she was always obedient and loyal to the church. And then again, you think of people today, you know, who challenge the church. You know, you ask yourself, how loyal are we still? This, I wanted to show you this bridge here, which again is still in Florence. It's called the Ponte Vecchio. If you've ever been to Florence, you've seen this bridge. It's most unusual. It covers the Arno River. And all of those little windows you see are shops and restaurants, and there's a lot of jewelry stores. It's actually kind of an expensive shopping area, but it's a bridge that you can cross over. And she used that in her writings. Catherine used that in her writings as a symbol of Christ. She said, Christ is like the bridge in Florence. And Christ takes us from one side of the river where we have the world and its sinfulness to the other side where we can find God. And we cross this bridge, usually in the company of other people, and we stop and we get something to eat, or we look at the beauty, or we go slowly, or we go fast. And everything, the bridge represents everything that Christ has to offer us on our journey. So she likes to take a certain point of architecture or an experience in life, and she likes to enhance it to show you, how is this like Christ? So that's kind of a famous image that she gives us. Let's see what's next here. Okay, next. She has a lot of wonderful quotations, and you can access these very easily on the internet or in her books. But one of the quotations I love is, "You, eternal Trinity, are a deep sea. The more I enter you, the more I discover, and the more I discover, the more I seek you." She saw the sea a lot because of her journeys back and forth to Avignon, and she always followed the coastline, the Mediterranean Sea. And another quotation about the sea, which I love, is, the sea is in the fish, and the fish is in the sea, as God is in me and I am in God. I'll say that again because I just love it, and you have to imagine what this would be like. The sea is in the fish, as the fish is in the sea, as God is in me and I am in God. So God is like the sea and we are like the fish, and we're in the sea, but we're filled with the sea at the same time. So you can see how deep her meditation was. So we can say that she had an incarnational theology that takes seriously the effects of Christ taking on human flesh. She knew the truth of God's message. Do you know, daughter, who you are and who I am? And if so, your blessedness is in your grasp. You are the one who is not. I am the one who is. So lots of really beautiful quotations like that. She died on April 29th, 1380, in Rome at the age of 33, the same age that Jesus was when he died. She had burned herself out for the mission she was given. Some people say she starved herself to death. She fasted so much that in the last month, all that she took was communion. But she just kept, every day, she kept walking across that street down to St. Peter's to go to Mass. Her body is at rest in Rome in the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, and not unusual for those days, her head is in Siena. So her body is in Rome and her head is in Siena. Her friends from Siena, including her own mother, processed to Rome and removed her head and brought it back to Siena in procession. So if you're ever in Siena, you can see her head. Anyway, that was just a way of honoring her and reverencing her. She was a most unusual woman, yet extremely humble. And one thing I wanted to point out is some of us today are religious and some are lay people, and she is a woman for everyone. You know, she herself was a lay Dominican, and she offers us a spirituality, I think, that can be for anyone. So I'm going to stop there for Catherine, and again, ask if you have any comments, especially the Dominicans among us. Anything else that you'd want to bring out about Catherine or questions you have about her? How many of you have been to Siena? Lots. It really is. I mean, there's so much of the city that's still preserved the way it was. Welcome back, Kelly. You there? Oh. It looks like she's on a boat. Are you on a boat?
No.
Oh, okay. We're just finishing up with Catherine of Siena, and I'm wondering if anybody has any other insights into Catherine that would be relevant for today.
I guess one part that struck my attention there, you labeled as how she wrestled with the love of God between love of neighbor, and if she could have stayed in her room, in her cell, and just stay with, and how she argued with Christ about going out. And I guess I can relate that to my life. I'm a pastor too, about the difference between worship and honoring God, or through honoring God through service of neighbor. And I could see that related to St. Francis, and it's a tough thing to wrestle with, to get that balance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Judith Ann?
I'm unmuting you here. Just give a second.
We've celebrated the feast of Catherine here in our bubbles.
Because you're tomorrow.
Yeah, that's right. I feel as though I've fallen in love with Catherine this year in a whole new way, and I think it's contextual in the sense that what we're all experiencing at the moment is part of what she experienced with the Black Plague. And I've been entering into my own cell of self-knowledge and asking myself lots of questions, because in the past I've been a little bit perhaps threatened by her incredible giftedness and thinking, well, that's for her, but I'm just ordinary. And that's great temptation to kind of make that comparison or be competitive about spirituality and holiness and whatever else. But I think, and it came out with Hildegard too, that the great gift is that we're all graced, we're all gifted, but in different ways. And she's kind of reminded me about being open to God's grace, and whether it's walking on the right foot today or the left foot tomorrow or whatever, that movement is the call to live a balanced life and not to be comparing myself with others, but to be true to who I am, to be true to myself.
Yeah, I love that quote from God. I am the one who is, you are the one who is not.
And it's
lest you think you're somebody.
Yes.
Patty? Can you unmute her, Grant?
Working on it, yeah.
There.
Okay.
What I was thinking of when you were talking about confronting the Pope, and this is also to give support, and I can't find her right now, about confronting the church. I think of Teresa Kane, when Sister Teresa Kane, a Mercy sister, and many of you remember when she confronted Pope John Paul II in Washington, D.C., about the ordination of women. And at that time, there was a whole group, I wasn't present, but there were a whole group of women and men who were present at that Mass at the cathedral, and they stood up with her when she went up to the Pope. And they had they wore armbands. I'm looking for mine because someone gave it to me. They wore armbands that were jean armbands, or I guess anybody could wear any kind of an armband. And I can see that, I'm not quite sure, is it Iman? I don't know which. Anyway, Aman, you're shaking your head. I'm trying to look at your last
Elizabeth,
name.
that's Elizabeth.
Oh, she only has her last name there right now. But anyway, and standing up. So it's amazing to think that we still are. And there's a lot more to be said about that. But anyway, I just want to raise her up, especially on the Feast of Catherine of Siena and women of courage throughout every century.
Trying to think of that quotation, speak out as if you had a million voices for silence.
Oh, right. Yeah.
How does that go?
I know what you're saying. I don't remember.
Silence can kill the world, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, she was really big on speaking out. Aren't we all, huh? Well, let's look at Teresa of Avila.
Kelly had a
comment.
Her hand was up.
Did you have something, Kelly?
Yeah. I just want to, when she was talking about, when she's said something about, why is she wandering around, it just really, really reminds me of Father Samuel saying a Christian's native country is wherever God calls them. So clearly, Father Samuel was the founder of Siena. He was clearly influenced by Catherine of Siena, and that makes me happy.
Yeah.
Because I think we're all mendicants at this point.
Yeah. Joan, did you want to say something? Unmute.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. When you said that about Catherine with all the quotes about her, some of the things that you're talking about remind me of one about her where it's, if you are who God means you to be, you will set the world on fire.
Yes. I think I have that quote in there someplace, but
something
anyway, that's
like that.
wonderful. Yeah. Catherine is a great resource for many, many wonderful things. And you think all that she accomplished in 33 years, that really. Where do we get to Therese of Lisieux? She was only 24 when she died. The rest of us are kind of slackers. Okay, so we're going to move to Teresa of Avila. Time is going so quickly here, I have to hurry. Okay, our screen. There we go. So Teresa, then, we're going to skip ahead a couple hundred years, and Teresa was a Carmelite, which again is an order, not the Benedictines, it's a different one, but they follow, the prayer and the work and a lot of the same values. And she lived in the 16th century. And Elizabeth Dreyer would say her theological niche is the theology of the human person. That was, what do we say? Hildegard was the Holy Spirit. Catherine was the Incarnation. And Teresa of Avila is the theology of the human person. She was a very astute observer of the human person. By the way, this image of her was done by Peter Paul Rubens. It's one of my favorites. Okay, next. So she was born Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada, and she was born March 28, 1515 in Avila to a noble and wealthy family. Her father had 2 children from a previous marriage, and her parents had 10 more. You'll notice that a lot of these people come from very big families, and that was more typical in those days. And a lot of them come from wealthy families, which I think is interesting, noble and wealthy families. Okay, now keep in mind that this period of time in the 16th century was the Reformation period. When did Luther, Grant, can you tell me when Luther?
1540s.
1540s, when he first came out with his theses that he was challenging the church. So it was a period of time when there was extreme unrest in the church. It seems like there always is, but this was the Protestant Reformation period. And also it was the period when the Inquisition was formulated. And so her father, was very, let's see, what do we have next here? Okay, you can put the next one on. A description of St. Teresa of Avila. Like Jesus, she was a mystery of paradoxes, wise yet practical, intelligent yet much in tune with her experience, mystic yet an energetic reformer, a holy woman, a womanly woman. It was one of her biographers who said that. And can you also say that about Catherine and about Hildegard? I mean, I think so much, they are so much alike. When she was 13, her mother died. Her paternal grandfather was Jewish. And this was a problem in the family. They called them conversos. They were forcibly converted and seen as kind of less than other people. So that was something she kind of carried with her in her growing up years, and she was badly treated. And this personal history affected her in ways that she related to society and the way that she saw persons. So it's just a personal part of her ancestry that affected her later. Okay, next. I like that quotation, trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. It's a good advice. She refers to the early stages of prayer as frequent solitary conversations with Him who, as we know, loves us. So again, as a younger person, she would read a lot, she prayed a lot, and she actually, when she was 20 years old, she entered the convent of Our Lady of the Incarnation, is what it was, without her father's consent. So here she was in the convent, in the Carmelite convent, and she this was a very large convent. There were 180 women who lived there at the time. And again, it was a situation that Hildegard found where the nuns moved in and out freely, returned home often, visited people in the city, had parties, had their male friends over. So the ideal, again, it was, I told you that Hildegard had tried to reform the Benedictines. Well, Teresa finds the same thing, and she's going to reform the Carmelites for the same reasons. They had lost their ideal of enclosure and silence, and she really noticed that they needed to reform. This particular quote here, and I put it in both Spanish and in English because it is very famous in both languages. Let nothing trouble you, let nothing frighten you, all things are passing. God never changes, patience obtains all things. He who possesses God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. And that's something that I think comforts a lot of people. And it kind of crystallizes her spirituality, which got deeper and deeper as she got older. Let's see, next. And she was a very happy person. She was very physically ill. They say she never had a day in her life that she wasn't without pain. But at the same time, she was at peace and she was happy and joyful, and she loved to dance and she loved to sing. And so I think this quotation expresses something of her own way of life. May today there be peace within. May you trust God that you are exactly where you are meant to be. May you not forget the infinite possibilities that are born of faith. May you use those gifts that you have received and pass on the love that has been given to you. May you be content knowing you are a child of God. Let this presence settle into your bones and allow your soul the freedom to sing, dance, praise, and love. It is there for each and every one of us. They say she loved to dance the flamenco with castanets. So you can picture her, as this great saint who is so joyful that she expresses it in singing and dancing. Next. This is another, again, very famous quote of hers that is used a lot. Christ has no body here on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Yours are the eyes through which to look at Christ's compassion for the world. Yours are the feet with which he is to go about doing good. And yours are the hands with which he is to bless us now. She really reflects Paul's letter to the Galatians, where Paul says, I live now, not I, but Christ lives in me. And Christ's risen body takes on the form of our own bodies in life, and that's what we use to praise God and to serve God. This particular statue is done by the famous Baroque artist Bernini, and it's called The Ecstasy of St. Teresa, and it's in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. It's a bigger than life-size statue, and it really shows Teresa in ecstasy, almost to the point where it looks like she's having an orgasm. I mean, it's so sensual that some people thought it was indecent. But she has this experience of an angel piercing her heart with an arrow, and that's her mystical experience of God's presence in her life and the pain that it caused her, but it was a pain that was sweet. And it really says something about her as a powerful woman. Her theology, it's a struggle again between, as in Catherine too, individual prayer, contemplative prayer, mystical prayer, and then communal prayer. So that's my experience of God and versus our experience of God. And she always was trying to, in the convent where she founded several convents. In the convent, she tried to balance that off between the individual and the communal, and the individual and the communal, because she could see the interplay there. And that was something that got her in trouble sometimes, because some people wanted to, they wanted to have just the communal, and some people wanted to have just the singular. If you could really capsulize her life in a few words, it would be pray and serve. And that was the ideal that she was called to. And so this was her spiritual companion, John of the Cross, who was also a Carmelite and who was busy reforming the Carmelites on the men's branch. She did the women's branch and he did the men's branch, but they worked together on it, and they were very influenced by one another. And John of the Cross also wrote a lot of very famous spiritual books and was also persecuted for what he tried to do, among the Carmelites especially. Okay, let's see. She founded new convents. Just before that, I would say she founded new convents at the rate of 1 and sometimes 2 per year. She was an ingenious administrator with a flair for organization, an astute diplomat, and wise in the world of finance, litigation, and contract negotiation. Her financial worries, business deals, and personnel problems challenged her life of prayer but never spoiled it. So she was generous, self-spending, and exhausting in her service. And prayer grew deeper and deeper. Spending ourselves serving God in the world created out of divine love. So there's so much that could be said about her, because she was really one of the greatest women saints in history. But let's stop right there and see just at the ending of that. She died of tuberculosis on October 4th, 1582. And her final, this little, it isn't that important, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Her final illness overtook her on one of her journeys from Burgos to Alba de Tormes, just as Catholic Europe was making the switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar, which required the excision of the dates of 5 to 14 October. She died either before midnight of the 4th of October or early in the morning of 15th of October. So she was straddling the two calendars. And the 15th of October is her feast day. And her last words were, "My Lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O my Lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come." It's time to meet one another. Okay, so let's stop there and have a little conversation about Teresa of Avila, who was very different from the next Therese that we're going to do, and the last one. We're getting any comments about Teresa of Avila before we move along to Therese of Lisieux? Any quotations you know that you like especially? One thing she said, and people often quote her, she was mucking through the mud and was tired and was cold and was dirty. And she said to God, God, if this is the way you treat your friends, no wonder you don't have very many of them. Yeah, she must have had a good sense of humor and a real kind of back and forth relationship with God. Okay, I'm going to move right into Therese of Lisieux then, and then we can have a little conversation at the very end. So should we take, okay. Now the thing about Therese of Lisieux is she was born in the 19th century, which is quite a jump, and all the images we have of her are actual photographs. The others were statues or paintings. So anyway, I'll just quickly go through this. She was born January 2nd, 1873, and she died September 30th, 1897. So she was only 24 years old when she died. And she, quotation here, I give thanks to my Jesus for making me walk in darkness, and in this darkness I enjoy profound peace. I only desire that my darkness may obtain light for sinners. Okay, next. These were her parents, Zélie Guérin and Louis Martin, and they lived in northern France in Normandy in a town called Alençon, which was famous, still is famous, for its lace making. And her mother was a very expert lace maker, and she had her own business. And the father was a watchmaker, and they were so holy. They both wanted to be religious, but neither one was accepted. So they decided to get married and have a family that would be religious, which they did. And they had 9 children, 5 of whom lived to adulthood. And of those 5, all of them became sisters. So they were a pretty extraordinary family. Next. Okay, these are the daughters who lived to adulthood. The one in the top middle is actually the mother, Zélie. And the one on her left is Marie, the oldest, and then Pauline, Léonie, Céline, and Thérèse. So Léonie became a sister of the Visitation, and the other 4 became Carmelite nuns in Lisieux. Next. So at age 3, this is a picture of her at age 3, and just about a year after that, when she was about 4, her mother died. Now, Therese was the youngest child, and this was extremely traumatic for her. And after she died, the family moved to Lisieux, and we have a picture of their house. They were rather well-to-do bourgeoisie, as they say in French, family, and they lived together in this house. It was called Les Buissonnets, which means the little bushes. Next. And here she is at age 8, a photograph of her. And she went to a school run by the Benedictine nuns at a nearby abbey. And she did well in school, but she was bullied because she was so young and because she was so smart. And so it was pretty miserable for her. And then when she was a little older, she was able to be homeschooled by her older sister. And here she is at age 13. And when she became 13 or 14, around that time, she started to develop some health problems. And she had, they thought it was some kind of neurological disease. And she was very, very sick, and she had seizures. But she had the experience of looking at a statue of the Virgin Mary when she was about this age, 13. And the Virgin smiled at her. And after that, she was well, and she was at peace, and she developed more normally. And she said that was a whole new experience for her. When she was about 15, This picture is interesting because it was the first picture we have of her with her hair up, and she put her hair up so she'd look older. Because when she was 15, she wanted to enter the Carmelite monastery, but they didn't take girls that young. So she and her father and her older sister Celine went on a pilgrimage to Rome, and I think shows the pilgrimage. Yeah, they had an audience with Pope Leo XIII, and at the audience, she hugged him and said, please, please let me enter the monastery at Carmel at age 15. And he said, well, whatever God wills will happen. And she was just hysterical because she wanted so much to do this. But it was a year later, that she was able to enter. And this is the monastery where she entered and which is still there today. So she was 16 years old when she entered this monastery. And next. This is about at that time when this is how she looked. I do not know what more I could have in heaven than I already have on earth, except that I shall see God. As for being with him, I am that always, even here on earth. So she was a very sensitive young woman and deeply religious, and had a real sense of God's action in her life. Next. And then she was a year later, by this time she was 17, she became a novice, and the novices wore white veils like this, and she took the name St. Teresa of the Child Jesus and the Holy Face. The Carmelite nuns have this custom of having a patron. So her patron was the Child Jesus, but then she wanted a second patron called the Holy Face. So that was her official name in religious. Next. And then she made profession of vows at age 17 in 1890. And she was always struggling to know, because she was she was bright, but very simple person, unsophisticated, kind of sheltered. And she always wanted to know what God wanted her to do, give her a vocation or a mission. And she wanted to be a martyr, and she couldn't be a martyr, and she couldn't be a priest, and she couldn't be a missionary. So about this time when she was professed, she had this sense of Jesus saying to her, at last I have found my calling. My call is love. Certainly I have found my place in the church, and you gave me this very place, my God. In the heart of the church, my mother, I will be love. So it wasn't like my vocation to love, but to be love. And that's the vision or the focus that she had for the rest of her life. Next. So here she is. She's the one from the second from the left with the black veil on because she's professed, and the others are novices. And by age 20, she was in charge of all the novices. You can imagine that, she had a lot of responsibility. This is a picture, just a candid shot of them doing the laundry. They had a pool of water out and back, and they would wash the clothes in the laundry. One little thing about her, she always didn't want to hurt anybody's feelings, and she said they were doing the laundry one time, and one of the novices took her apron and pinned it to her shoulder to make sure that it wouldn't fall off, but she pinned it right into her skin. And instead of saying, ouch, get that pin off of there, she left it there because she didn't want to hurt her feelings. But that's just the kind of person she was. That, she was just like Sister Mary Nice. But she also found it very difficult to be with people who were not very as nice as she was. So she struggled a lot with relationships. She wrote a couple of plays about Joan of Arc. This is a picture of herself in the role of Joan of Arc. And I wanted to read you something about that. A second here. Because she was quite identified with Joan of Arc's spirituality. Here it is. She spoke of her martyrdom not as helping get the King of France crowned, but as getting the, I can't read my writing here, but as getting the king. Wait, I better just do it from memory. Joan of Arc, her whole mission was to get the King of France crowned, and Therese said, my mission is to get the king of the universe crowned with love. So she identified with Joan of Arc's mission, and she just envied her because she got to be a martyr, and she wanted to be a martyr. So very often she spoke of Joan of Arc as a way of being in the world, and she wanted to be like her. Next. Oh, this is her death, final years. She died of tuberculosis at age 24. It was an extremely painful death. And besides that, she entered into a kind of a dark night of the soul where she couldn't pray and she didn't feel close to God and she felt like she was worthless. And she overheard one of the sisters in the community saying of her, "What are we going to write in Teresa's obituary? She's never done anything special." So she realized that her life was so simple that it wasn't worthy of being written up. And yet now you can see, next slide, she died in September in 1897, was canonized in 1925, which was very early, and named Doctor of the Church in 1997. So all of that happened very quickly. Next. And this is the Basilica of St. Therese in Lisieux. And there are over 2 million visitors a year who come here. It's the second most famous place outside of Lourdes. She also wrote 54 poems, 21 prayers, 260 extant letters, and 8 plays. So she, in her very, very short lifetime, she really produced a lot of literature. I believe that was the last slide, right? Oh, yeah. Okay, let's just take a minute because we're going over time here, but about your perceptions of these women in general. What are some threads that you see that are common for all of them? Questions that we can look at it for ourselves in this century, and challenges for us. Yeah, Kelly?
Well, I'm just struck with their absolute devotion to the mission of getting the message out, that it wasn't about them, but that God had placed on their hearts, you know, I have something for you to do. It's really important. We don't have time for your doubt. Let's get on it. And wow, I wish to live like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's quite inspired. They're all quite inspiring, especially, you know, being a woman. It's just, wow. We need to look at them a lot more. I mean, I think that in my circles, people don't talk about them as much, and they're really quite the inspiration.
The role models, even for
today. I just really want to go get icons and and really, really study them. Thank you so much for this class.
Well, it takes us.
Echo what Kelly. Oh, I would echo what Kelly said, that they stayed with the mission that they felt was given to them, and even in the face of, they all faced opposition in some way, but they didn't let that deter them. They listened to their own voice, the voice of the Spirit within them. So indeed, they are for us.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for, Eileen?
Just real quick, I just think they're all so intelligent, and they use that intelligence, but they were complete people, not just intelligent. They just had so much more to give. And then the other thing is, I have a question about the niche for Teresa of Lisieux.
Oh, yeah, the theology of the cross, suffering.
Okay,
Yeah, thanks
you.
for asking that. I forgot to mention that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's, I mean, you could spend a lifetime, studying about, each one of them, I find it interesting that the church has selected those 4 to be honored as doctors of the church. And then the other thing I said this morning, I was thinking I could think of a lot of other people too, and that's something to think of. Who are some other women today or within the last few hundred years that you think could be named doctors of the church? Anybody have any ideas? Joanne?
The ones that you mentioned, like Joan Chittister and the one that works in the jail, and Elizabeth Johnson. There's just a whole slew of really good people right now that you can follow that I think would make doctors of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And all the ones I'm thinking of are women.
Yeah. I was thinking of Edith Stein. Do you know Edith Stein? Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She was killed in the concentration camps during the Second World War. Joan?
Mm-hmm.
Unmute.
I was wondering. I'll just throw in, I was wondering about Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That's who I was trying to say.
Oh, yes. Well, and even lesser known women that we know in our own lives, our mothers and our sisters and, our friends, who really have so much to give. And, are we really honoring them and listening to them as much as we could these days?
Yeah, I'm thinking of Sister Simone and the whole network area because, wow, they are challenging poverty. They are challenging injustice, and they're speaking out and attacking every structure that is anti-gospel values.
Yeah. Judith Ann, did you?
Yeah. Our Prime Minister, she's not a church person in any way, and it's really interesting to listen. It's really interesting to listen to her on the television every day, and the fidelity, and she doesn't get flustered. She's just calm. She speaks with authority. She speaks the truth, and her greatest desire from this COVID-19 is that we won't have any more homeless people, because we've managed to find homes for people during this time. So if we can do it now, those inspirational messages that she gives every day, she wouldn't even be thinking about being a doctor of the church, let alone a saint, but just being who she is. It's wonderful.
Patty? Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
I was thinking yesterday, of course, we're all thinking of so many people involved with the virus, but there was a very poignant death yesterday that was announced of a doctor woman, Lorna, and I think Green was her last name, in a Presbyterian hospital in Manhattan, they had a beautiful picture of her, and she was young, and she was ahead of the department there. People spoke about how kind she was, etc. Anyway, she got the virus, she recuperated, she went back to work, she went back home to her family, and her father's a doctor too, and she committed suicide. And her father said, I would like her to be remembered as a hero. And I've noticed in the news that we don't speak about Lutherans or Catharines or whatever. We speak about Christians. And they said that she was a very devout Christian woman. And we prayed for her yesterday. She's one of the many women whose names probably will not be remembered for a long time. But we prayed for her because she had to look into the face of hell, the face of people dying, agonizing deaths every day. And it comes to a point that you cannot face it anymore. So there are so many unnamed people at this time. So I just really want to remember them.
Yes. Well, Grant, we're going to have just a closing prayer. So Grant's going to put it on. And I want to thank everyone for being together, and we'll do it again sometime, huh?
Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. That was great. Wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.